She pretended to smile, but the billionaire at table 9 saw the word "help" written on the napkin. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. The summer rain was pounding against the windows of the Grand Bistro, one of the most sophisticated restaurants in New York City, located in the heart of Manhattan. The establishment occupied the ground floor of a restored historic building, where Czech crystal chandeliers illuminated dark mahogany tables and chairs upholstered in Italian leather. The enticing aroma of fresh basil, golden garlic, and fine red wine lingered in the air, subtly mingling with the expensive perfumes wafting from the patrons of New York's high society. It was a rainy Thursday in February when the restaurant's activity reached its peak. Executives in Armani suits discussed million-dollar mergers while savoring chef Michael Johnson's famous lobster risotto. Socialites flaunted their latest Fashion Week acquisitions while sipping on Dom Pérignon champagne. The elegant murmur of conversations created a typical urban symphony of the economic elite in America. At table 9, strategically positioned in a corner that offered a privileged view of the entire dining room, sat Alexander Smith, 34 years old. His dark brown hair, always impeccably styled, was beginning to show a few silver strands at the temples, a touch that only accentuated his appearance as a successful man. His deep brown, analytical eyes had the peculiar gleam of someone accustomed to assessing people and situations in a matter of seconds. He stood 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that perfectly filled his tailored navy blue suit from Bergdorf Goodman. Alexander was the founder and CEO of Tech Vision USA, a technology solutions company for agriculture that had revolutionized the market over the past 8 years. He had started from scratch, with only a borrowed laptop and a visionary idea about agricultural automation. Today, his company was worth over $2 billion and had contracts with the largest farms in the Midwest. Forbes had placed him on the list of the most influential entrepreneurs in the country before he turned 35. But behind the facade of absolute success, Alexander carried traits that defined his complex personality. First, a compulsive curiosity about people in distress, something that had originated in childhood when he witnessed his mother struggle to support the family after his father's premature death. Second, an obsessive need to control situations, developed over the years as a defense mechanism against the uncertainties of business life. Third, a generosity he used as a shield for his own deep loneliness, distributing financial help as a way to fill the emotional void that money had never been able to eliminate. That night, while methodically cutting his filet Wellington, Alexander discreetly observed a woman at table 16. She had caught his attention the moment she entered the restaurant, accompanied by a maitre d' who led her to a solitary table by the window. What intrigued him was not just her beauty, wavy blonde hair cascading delicately over her shoulders, green eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world, and a simple yet elegant black dress that highlighted her slender silhouette. It was the striking contrast between her sophisticated appearance and the barely concealed desperation emanating from every movement. The woman, whom he still did not know was named Sarah, nervously fiddled with the napkin next to her untouched plate. Her delicate hands, visibly trembling, betrayed an internal tension that contrasted with her upright posture and the polite smile she offered the waiter whenever he approached. Alexander, with his experience in reading people honed through years of business negotiations, immediately sensed that she was not there to dine. She was there to think, to make an important decision, or perhaps to escape from something. "Mr. Smith, aren't you going to try the dessert? The chef specially prepared your favorite molten chocolate cake," said David, the waiter, who had been serving him for 3 years and knew his dining habits. "Not today, David. Just bring me an espresso," Alexander replied without taking his eyes off the mysterious woman. "And tell me, do you know the lady at table 16? David discreetly followed Alexander's gaze and shook his head. "First time I've seen her here, sir. She made the reservation by phone 2 hours ago, specifically requested a table with a view of the street." arrived promptly at 9 but barely touched her food. It was then that Alexander noticed the almost imperceptible movement. The woman picked up the napkin, glanced around quickly to ensure no one was watching, and began to write something with the pen she had taken from her purse. Her hands trembled visibly as she traced the letters, and when she finished, she carefully folded the napkin and placed it next to the plate, as if it were just another casual detail of the table. But Alexander saw. His eyes, trained to capture details in business presentations, did not miss the movement, nor the expression of controlled despair that took over her face after writing. There was something deeply unsettling about that seemingly innocent scene, something that triggered all his protective instincts and compulsive curiosity. The waiter, David, responsible for her table, approached to clear the nearly untouched plate. She smiled politely, murmured something about not having an appetite due to the heat, and only asked for the check. It was then that Alexander impulsively stood up, leaving $50 on the table, a sum well above the bill, and deliberately walked toward her. "Excuse me," he said, stopping beside her table with the confident posture of someone used to taking the initiative. "Forgive my intrusion, but I noticed that you seemed to need help." Sarah raised her green eyes, and for a moment Alexander felt as if she were assessing not only his words, but his entire soul. There was a sharp intelligence in that gaze, a depth that contrasted with the apparent fragility of her situation. "And why do you think that?" she asked in a soft yet firm voice, laden with an— Alexander pointed discreetly to the folded napkin. "Because I saw what you wrote. And because I recognize the disguised desperation when I see it. I've been in tough situations before. For a moment, time seemed suspended between them. The noise of the restaurant, the conversations in the background, even the rain on the window, everything became secondary in the face of that first meeting that would forever change both of their lives. Sarah observed the man in front of her with the precision of someone who had studied human behavior for years. At 28, she not only held a master's degree in behavioral psychology from NYU, but also possessed a natural ability to read people that rivaled any seasoned executive. Her green eyes quickly analyzed Alexander. The confident yet not arrogant posture, the expensive suit without excessive ostentation, and most importantly, the genuine concern in his gaze, something rare to find in men of his social class. "Do you often approach unknown women in restaurants?" she asked, slowly unfolding the napkin where she had written "help" in shaky letters. The word lay there, exposed between them like a bridge over an abyss of mutual ignorance. Alexander smiled for the first time that night, a genuine smile that completely transformed his severe businessman expression. "It's not exactly a habit, but I also don't usually ignore when someone needs help. May I sit?" Sarah hesitated for a few seconds that felt eternal. Her mind quickly calculated the possibilities. He could just be another bored rich guy looking for adventure, or he could be exactly what she needed, a strategic exit from her desperate situation. She decided to take the risk. "Please," she said, gesturing to the empty chair in front of her. "But first, I need to know your name and why you're interested in the situation of a stranger." "Alexander Smith," he introduced himself, extending his hand firmly. "CEO of TechVision USA, and I was interested because—" He paused, carefully choosing his words. "Because I recognize the look of someone struggling against circumstances greater than herself. I've been there." "Sarah Johnson," she returned the handshake, noticing the controlled strength and the almost imperceptible calluses that indicated he was not just a spoiled heir. "Behavioral psychologist, independent consultant," and another pause, longer this time. "I'm currently in quite a complicated situation." The waiter, David, approached discreetly. "Would you like the check?" "Actually, bring 2 espressos and cancel her check," Alexander interjected. "Everything goes to my table." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. You take control of situations very quickly. Is that a behavioral pattern or a specific strategy for this occasion?" Alexander paused in the middle of adjusting the napkin on the table, surprised by her insight. You really are a psychologist. Most people would take weeks to make that observation. And most billionaire CEOs wouldn't approach a stranger writing help on a napkin, she retorted with a half-smile that eased the initial tension. So we're even in the atypical behavior department. The rain intensified outside, creating a more intimate atmosphere between the curtains of water streaming down the windows of the Grand Bistro. Alexander leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice. So tell me, Sarah, what kind of help do you need? Sarah took a deep breath, mentally organizing how to tell her story without revealing all her cards immediately. Her psychological training had taught her that information was power, and she needed to better assess this man before fully exposing herself. My family is traditional from the Midwest. My father, Colonel Retired Edward Johnson, was a former minister of agriculture in the last administration. My mother, Mary Antoinette, comes from a family of farmers for 5 generations. They arranged my marriage to George Anderson, the owner of the largest soybean exporter in the state. Alexander nodded, immediately recognizing the names. I know the reputation of the Anderson family. Solid business, a lot of political and economic influence. In theory, he would be considered a good match by traditional standards. Exactly, Sarah confirmed, nervously stirring the coffee cup that had just arrived. The problem is that I don't love George, never have, and he sees this marriage more as a business merger than a union of love. Worse still, I found out he has a history of abusive relationships with ex-girlfriends. Alexander's face hardened. Abusive how? Psychological control, social isolation, emotional blackmail. A former employee of his company discreetly approached me 3 months ago to warn me. She dated him for 2 years and almost had a nervous breakdown. Sarah lowered her voice even more. My family doesn't believe it. They say it's gossip from a jealous woman, and that the marriage will happen anyway. Alexander felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, the same he felt when witnessing injustices in the business world. And you ran away from the Midwest to New York City to escape this? Not exactly running away, Sarah corrected, revealing for the first time a strategic glimmer in her eyes. I came to New York City because here I can build my own life, my own career, and prove to my family that I am capable of being financially independent. If I can do that, maybe they will respect me enough to accept my refusal of the marriage. Smart, Alexander admitted, impressed by her calculated approach. Much more effective than just running away. But I imagine it's not that simple. Sarah sighed deeply. The wedding is scheduled for 4 months from now. My parents cut off my financial support when they found out I came to New York City to throw a tantrum, as they call it. I have savings for 2 more months at most. And George, he's not taking the situation well. Is he pressuring you? He comes to New York City every week. He tries to convince me with expensive gifts, promises of freedom after the wedding, even the proposal of a marriage of appearances, where each of us would live our lives separately. Sarah paused, staring intently at Alexander. But I know his psychological profile. Men like George can't. Raphael remained silent for a few moments, processing all the information. His business mind was already formulating strategies, but a deeper part of him was touched by the courage and intelligence of that woman. There was something about her that intrigued him beyond the dramatic situation, an inner strength that contrasted with her apparent vulnerability. And what exactly were you expecting to happen when you wrote help on that napkin? He finally asked. Sarah smiled for the first time with genuine amusement. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe it was just a way to externalize desperation. Or maybe, she studied him intently, maybe it was fate putting the right person in the right place. Do you believe in fate? I believe in opportunities. And you, Alexander Smith, seem to be a very interesting opportunity. The raw sincerity of her statement surprised them both. It was the first moment of total honesty in the conversation, establishing a new level of frankness between them. Interesting how? Alexander asked, genuinely curious about the psychological assessment she was making of him. You are successful, influential, and clearly have the resources to help. But more importantly, you have a compulsion to help people in distress, probably something rooted in your personal history. And she paused deliberately. You are alone in an expensive restaurant on a Thursday night, which suggests that your professional success does not translate into personal satisfaction. Alexander laughed openly, a genuine sound that echoed above the murmur of the restaurant. You are frighteningly good at what you do. It's my profession, she replied simply. So, what do you say, Alexander? Are you interested in a mutually beneficial proposal? Sarah's proposal hung in the air between them like an unrevealed card in a high-stakes poker game. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly drumming on the mahogany table as he assessed the woman in front of him with renewed interest. There was something fascinating about how she managed to be simultaneously vulnerable and calculating, desperate and strategic. Mutually beneficial, he repeated slowly, savoring the words. That presupposes that you have something to offer beyond a dramatic story and pretty green eyes, Sarah smiled. A smile that revealed a confidence that contrasted with the fragility she had shown moments before. I do. Specialization in behavioral psychology applied to corporate environments. A master's focused on executive performance optimization, and practical experience in profile analysis for recruitment and leadership development. Go on, said Alexander, intrigued by the change in her tone. Your company, TechVision USA, has grown exponentially in recent years. I read about it in Forbes, Sarah revealed, showing that she had not arrived there completely unprepared. Rapid growth creates specific problems: difficulty maintaining company culture, leadership conflicts, resistance to change from long-time employees. I bet you have at least 3 key executives subtly sabotaging the new guidelines. Alexander's face changed completely. The relaxed expression gave way to intense focus. How do you know that? Because it's a classic behavioral pattern in tech companies, the transition from startup to corporation in less than a decade, Sarah explained, leaning forward. Founders maintain a total control mindset, but the structure grows beyond the capacity for micromanagement. The result, mid-level executives feel undervalued and start creating passive resistance. Alexander fell silent for a long moment, his mind racing through the latest board meetings, the reports that always arrived late, the communication failures that seemed to happen with suspicious frequency. Sarah had hit a sore spot that he hadn't even realized was exposed. You're proposing to work as a consultant for my company in exchange for support to resolve your family situation, he said, not as a question, but as a confirmation of understanding. Exactly. 6 months of intensive consulting to identify and resolve leadership bottlenecks at TechVision. In return, you helped me establish my own consulting firm here in New York City, provide references for potential clients, and, she hesitated for a moment, offer discreet protection against pressure from my family and from George. Protection how? Sarah took a deep breath before responding. George is a businessman. He understands the language of power and influence. If I am professionally associated with someone of your caliber, he will think twice before using more persuasive methods. The implication hung heavily between them. Alexander understood that the situation was more serious than she had initially revealed. Has he used persuasive methods before? He asked in a controlled, calm voice. 2 weeks ago, he showed up at my apartment unannounced. When I refused to open the door, he sat on the building stairs for 3 hours. The neighbors started complaining, and I ended up having to talk to him. It was intimidating. Alexander felt that familiar anger rise again, but this time directed specifically at a man he had never met but already despised. And your family? Do they know about his behavior? My mother thinks it's a demonstration of love and persistence. My father says that a real man fights for what he wants. Only my Grandma Mary, seems to understand that something is wrong. But she is 89 years old and lives in a small town in the Midwest. Her opinion doesn't carry weight in family decisions. The waiter David approached discreetly. Sorry to interrupt, but the restaurant is preparing to close. Can I bring you anything else? Alexander looked around and realized they were one of the few remaining couples at the Grand Bistro. The rain had eased, and the city lights created golden reflections in the water puddles on the street. "The check, please," he said, then turned to Sarah. "How about we continue this conversation in a more private place? I have an office 10 minutes from here." Sarah quickly assessed the proposal. Her psychological training alerted her to the risks of accompanying a stranger, no matter how well-intentioned he seemed. But her desperate situation and her intuition about his character weighed more heavily in the balance. "Okay," she agreed, "but I want to make it clear that this is a business meeting. I'm proposing a professional partnership, not other things." Alexander smiled sincerely. "Sarah, if I wanted other things, I wouldn't need elaborate schemes involving business consulting. Women interested in my money are unfortunately abundant in New York City." Her response surprised him. "Exactly. That's why you're alone on a Thursday night. You can't distinguish between women who want your money and women who might want you for who you really are." The observation hit Alexander like a punch in the stomach. It was true, brutally true, and the fact that she could verbalize something he himself avoided thinking about showed just how insightful she really was. "Touché," he admitted. "You're really good at what you do." 20 minutes later, they were on the 23rd floor of the Skyline building in the heart of Fifth Avenue. The Tech Vision office occupied the entire floor, with a panoramic view of the city that sparkled under the gentle drizzle still falling. The glass walls and minimalist furniture created a futuristic atmosphere that contrasted with the classic decor of the restaurant. Sarah walked to the window, observing the lights stretching to the horizon. "Impressive. Did you build all this in 8 years?" 10, actually," Alexander corrected, pouring 2 glasses of Scotch whiskey from a sidebar. "The first 2 years were in my mom's basement in a suburb in New Jersey." "A suburb in New Jersey?" Sarah turned, surprised. "That's not what I expected to hear. My father died when I was 16, a heart attack at 42. My mom, Grandma Rose, worked as a cleaner for years to keep me in technical school." Alexander approached, offering her the glass. "I learned very early that money is no guarantee of anything, but that lack of money is a guarantee of suffering." Sarah accepted the whiskey, studying his face. "And that explains your compulsion to help people in need. You project your story onto others." "Probably," he agreed without defensiveness. "But in this specific case, I think there's more than just psychological projection." "What do you mean?" Alexander walked to his desk and grabbed a tablet, quickly navigating through some files. "George Anderson. His company has an interesting history of hostile takeovers of rural properties. Small farmers facing financial difficulties, especially widowed women, are pressured to sell for below market values." Sarah turned pale. "How do you know this?" "Because 3 years ago, he tried to do the same thing with my aunt's property in a small town in New Jersey. She had lost her husband and was struggling to maintain the farm. George offered a ridiculous amount, and when she refused, accidents started happening. Fences cut, cattle escaping, problems with suppliers." Alexander paused significantly. "I had to intervene financially and legally to protect her." "My God," Sarah whispered, placing the glass on the table with trembling hands. "Does that mean that he has a pattern of abusive behavior that goes far beyond personal relationships?" Alexander completed. "And that your family, consciously or unconsciously, is handing you over to a dangerous man." The silence that followed was filled only by the distant sound of traffic on Fifth Avenue and the gentle patter of rain on the windows. Sarah processed the information, while Alexander watched the emotions pass over her face. Shock, anger, determination. "So," she finally said, her voice steady, "it seems our partnership will be more necessary than I imagined." "It seems so," Alexander agreed. "The question is, are you ready to find out how far his influence goes?" The first 3 months of the partnership between Sarah and Alexander unfolded like a complex dance between growing trust and carefully guarded secrets. The Tech Vision office became Sarah's second home, where she set up a small consulting room on the 23rd floor with a prime view of the bustling Fifth Avenue. The minimalist decor she chose, a brown leather armchair, a glass table, and a few plants, deliberately contrasted with the technological coldness of the rest of the environment, creating a welcoming space for her sessions with executives. The smell of Brazilian coffee became a constant on the floor, mixed with the subtle aroma of Sarah's French perfume and the incessant sound of construction echoing through the growing city. New York City, with its frenetic energy and endless possibilities, provided the perfect backdrop for personal and professional reinventions. During the mornings, Sarah conducted one-on-one interviews with the company's executives, applying psychological tests and observing behavioral dynamics in meetings. Her findings were meticulously documented in reports that she presented to Alexander during the long lunches that had become routine between them. "Mark Silvera, your sales director," Sarah said on a rainy Tuesday in May, flipping through her notes as they shared a plate of grilled salmon in the building's executive restaurant. Classic case of imposter syndrome disguised as compensatory arrogance. He subtly sabotages decisions because he's afraid you'll discover he's not as competent as he appears. Alexander stopped chewing, processing the information. "Mark has been with me since the 3rd year of the company. He's always been one of my most loyal collaborators." "Exactly, and that terrifies him," Sarah explained, her green eyes shining with the intensity of someone who had found their true calling. "The more the company grows, the more he feels inadequate for the new level of responsibilities. So he creates small obstacles to justify potential failures before they can be attributed to his incompetence." "How did you figure this out?" Sarah smiled with professional satisfaction. "In the last 3 weeks, I noticed he always forgets to pass on crucial information to the sales team on Fridays, ensuring that problems arise on Mondays. When questioned, he always has a plausible excuse. But the pattern is too consistent to be a coincidence." Alexander leaned back in his chair, once again impressed by her insight. "And what's your recommendation?" "Direct conversation. He needs reassurance, not confrontation. Tell him you value his historical contribution and offer specialized training for the new demands. Men like Mark respond well when they feel they are seen as solutions, not problems. During the afternoons, they work together on implementing the suggested changes, creating a professional intimacy that gradually transcended strictly business boundaries." Alexander discovered that Sarah had a sarcastic sense of humor that emerged during moments of relaxation, while she learned to decipher his subtle signs of tension, like the habit of drumming his fingers when he was worried, or the way his eyes would narrow almost imperceptibly when he suspected some information. "You have a troubling tendency to take personal responsibility for systemic issues," Sarah noted on a Thursday as they reviewed the quarterly financial reports. "When the IT department fails to deliver a project on time, you immediately wonder what you did wrong, instead of questioning whether the deadlines were realistic. And that's a problem because—" Alexander raised an eyebrow, pretending not to know the answer. "Because it creates a culture of dependency where all employees expect you to solve everything, instead of developing autonomy to solve problems in their own areas," Sarah explained, organizing the papers scattered across the table. "Result, you work 14 hours a day while they work 8, and still feel justified in shifting the responsibility." It was during these moments of behavioral analysis that Alexander found himself observing Sarah with an attention that went beyond the professional. The way she lightly bit her lower lip when focused, how her blonde hair captured the golden light of the evening in New York City, how her voice took on a softer tone when she spoke about human vulnerabilities, all of this created a growing attraction that he struggled to keep under control. Sarah, in turn, was not immune to his understated charm. The way Alexander listened to her suggestions with genuine attention, without the typical defensive ego of successful executives, impressed her deeply. What touched her even more was the genuine generosity he showed to struggling employees, like when he discreetly advanced the salary of a secretary who needed surgery for her son, or when he created an emergency fund for families of employees in critical situations. Do you do this to fill an emotional void, or because you genuinely care? She asked on a Friday after witnessing Alexander authorize an interest-free loan for a technician who had lost his home in a fire. The question caught him off guard. I don't know. Maybe both. Is it important? It is, because it determines whether your generosity is sustainable in the long run, or if it will end up generating resentment when you realize you are being used. Sarah replied with the straightforward honesty that had become a hallmark of their interactions. During the evenings, when the office emptied and the city lit up below, they often extended their conversations beyond necessity. It was during these hours that the professional mask slipped and revealed the people behind the roles. "Tell me about your family," Alexander asked one of those nights as they contemplated the night view of New York City. Besides the basic facts you've already mentioned, Sarah fell silent for a moment, organizing thoughts and memories. "My father has always been a man of rigid convictions. A former military man, he believes that hierarchy and discipline are the foundation of any successful social structure. For him, questioning the decisions of elders is synonymous with disrespect and ingratitude." "And your mother?" "My mother is a product of a generation where women found fulfillment through the success of their husbands and children. She genuinely believes that my happiness will come from a good marriage, and that my insistence on having my own career is a rebellious phase that will soon pass." Sarah sighed deeply. "The most frustrating part is that they sincerely love me. They are not bad people, just limited by their own experiences." "And your grandmother? You mentioned she understands your situation." Sarah's face lit up for the first time when talking about family. "Grandma Mary is extraordinary. At 89, she has a lucidity and wisdom that impress me. She told me that in her youth, she also had to choose between an arranged marriage and her personal dreams. She chose marriage and spent decades regretting it. Why doesn't she intervene on your behalf? Because she learned that some battles each person needs to fight alone. But she called me last week and said something that stuck with me. Granddaughter, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something is more important than fear." Alexander nodded, understanding the depth of the connection between them. "She seems to be a wise woman." "Yes, and she was the only one who warned me about signs of controlling behavior in relationships. She said George has eyes that don't accept no for an answer." It was then that the reality of the situation returned to hover between them. George continued to show up in New York City weekly, increasingly insistent and less cordial. Sarah had moved apartments twice in the last 2 months, but he always managed to find out the new address. The flowers and expensive gifts he sent came with increasingly possessive notes. "You are mine, Sarah, and you will understand this sooner or later." "He is escalating the behavior," Sarah observed in a particularly tense conversation. "The pattern is classic. First charm and gifts, then inconvenient persistence, now demonstrations of power and control. The next stage is direct intimidation," Alexander completed, feeling a growing concern. "You need more concrete protection. I'm considering hiring private security, but that would cost more than I can afford at the moment." Alexander didn't hesitate. "I'll pay." "Alexander, I can't accept that. I'm already living in the apartment you rented, using the car you provided." "Sarah," he interrupted, placing his hand over hers on the table. "This is not charity. It's an investment in the safety of a valuable business partner, and—" he hesitated. "It's what any decent person would do for someone they care about." The admission hung between them. laden with implications that neither of them was ready to confront. Sarah was ready to explore completely. But their touch lingered longer than necessary, and both knew that the professional partnership was turning into something much more complex and dangerous. "Thank you," Sarah finally whispered, "for everything." "Don't thank me yet," replied Alexander, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Something tells me the hard part is just beginning." The New York winter arrived, with its characteristic persistent drizzle, turning the city into a mosaic of blurred lights and melancholic reflections. In June, when temperatures dropped to 59 degrees and the sky remained grey for consecutive days, the pressure on Sarah intensified dramatically. It was as if the cold brought with it a dark urgency that accelerated all events around her. On a particularly chilly Tuesday, Sarah was in her consulting office reviewing the psychological profiles of executives when her cell phone rang. The name on the screen made her freeze. "Mom." It was the first call from Mary Antoinette in 2 weeks, and Sarah knew this did not bode well. "Hello, Mom," she answered in a controlled voice, but her heart was already racing. "Sarah Johnson." Her mother's voice came laden with a cold formality that always preceded serious sermons. "I need to talk to you about those photographs that came into my hands." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What photographs?" "Photographs of you entering and leaving apartments, expensive restaurants, offices, always accompanied by the same man. A man who is not your fiancé." Mary Antoinette's voice trembled between anger and disappointment. "Sarah, how could you expose us to this humiliation?" Sarah closed her eyes, immediately understanding what had happened. George had hired a private investigator to document her life in New York. Her hands trembled as she held the phone. "Mom, I can explain." "Explain what?" "That you're having an affair with a stranger while a decent and honest man waits for you in the Midwest?" Her mother's voice rose. "Your father is furious, Sarah, furious and embarrassed. George showed us those photos with tears in his eyes, saying he is still willing to forgive and go ahead with the wedding." "Mom, please, listen to me." Sarah tried to keep calm, but her voice began to falter. "It's not what it looks like. Alexander is my business partner, not Alexander." Mary Antoinette interrupted. "You called this man by his first name? Sarah, have you completely lost your mind?" At that moment, Alexander entered the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee, but stopped immediately upon seeing the look of despair on Sarah's face. He made a silent gesture asking if he should leave, but she shook her head, indicating for him to stay. "Mom, you need to understand that I'm not doing anything wrong." Sarah tried again, her voice now more firm. "I'm building my career, proving that I can be independent." "Independent?" Mary Antoinette practically shouted. "You want independence? Then prove to us that you can be responsible. Come home now, marry George as planned, and stop this teenage fantasy that life is an American romantic movie." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear her own rapid breathing and, in the background, her father's muffled voice asking who her mother was talking to. "What if I refuse?" Sarah finally asked, with a courage that surprised even herself. The response came laden with a coldness that cut like a blade. "Then you are no longer our daughter, and you can forget any inheritance, any support, any return home. You will have to live with the consequences of your choices, Sarah, forever." The call ended abruptly, leaving Sarah staring at the silent phone in her hands. The tears she had held back throughout the conversation finally overflowed, and she collapsed into the leather armchair, sobbing with an intensity that came from the depths of her soul. Alexander approached carefully, placing the coffee on the table and kneeling beside the armchair. "Sarah, tell me what happened." Between choked sobs, she recounted the entire conversation. Alexander listened in silence, his expression progressively hardening as he grasped the gravity of the situation. "He's investigating you," Alexander said when she finished. "George hired someone to document all your movements." "I know." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hands. "The question is, how far is he willing to go?" The answer came in the form of a call to the office's landline. Alexander answered with his usual professional tone. Tech Vision USA, Alexander Smith. Mr. Smith, an unfamiliar male voice, deliberately cordial, echoed through the speaker. My name is George Anderson. I believe you know my fiancée, Sarah Johnson. Sarah turned pale, making desperate gestures for Alexander not to confirm she was there. Alexander understood immediately and kept his tone neutral. May I ask the reason for your call, Mr. Anderson? Of course, George replied with a cordiality that sounded clearly forced. You see, Sarah is going through a difficult time, a sort of pre-wedding crisis, if you will. Understandable in a young and sensitive woman like her. Alexander clenched his fists, but kept his voice controlled. Go on. What concerns me is that she may be influenced by people who do not have her best interests at heart. People who might see an opportunity to take advantage of her emotional vulnerability. George's voice took on a nuance of subtle threat. I'm sure you, as a successful businessman, understand the risks of getting involved with complicated situations. The implication was crystal clear. Alexander took a deep breath before responding. Mr. Anderson, I do not know what your relationship is with Miss Johnson, but I can assure you that any professional association in my company is conducted with the highest ethical standards. Professional? George repeated the word with a barely concealed sneer. Interesting. The photographs I have suggest a level of intimacy that goes beyond strictly professional. What photographs? Alexander asked, although he already knew the answer. Intimate dinners, late arrivals at her apartment, departures. In the same apartment's morning light, George listed each item with perverse satisfaction. Mr. Smith, Sarah is a promised woman. Our family has a reputation to uphold, and I have a business to protect. I'm sure you wouldn't want these misunderstandings to reach the ears of your investors and business partners. The threat was now explicit. Alexander looked at Sarah, who was listening to the entire conversation with an expression of growing horror. Mr. Anderson, Alexander said with a calmness he didn't feel, I suggest you keep this conversation civil. Veiled threats are not an effective way to resolve misunderstandings, George laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Threats? Mr. Smith, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm merely trying to protect all parties involved from unwanted consequences. Sarah needs to return home, to her family, to the man who loves her. And you need to focus on your business without unnecessary distractions. And what if I refuse to understand your suggestion? Alexander asked, his voice lowering to a dangerous tone. Well, George paused theatrically. It would be a shame if the IRS received anonymous information about certain irregularities in Tech Vision's operations, or if the trade press discovered the questionable circumstances surrounding the hiring of certain consultants, or if some of your key clients were informed about the risks of associating with companies that have dubious practices. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Sarah was now completely pale, realizing she had drastically underestimated George's power. Mr. Anderson, Alexander finally said, thank you for the enlightening phone call. I now have a very clear understanding of the kind of man I'm dealing with. I hope so, George replied with evident satisfaction. Sarah has until the end of this week to return home voluntarily. After that, I can't guarantee that the situation will remain amicable. The call ended, leaving a heavy silence in the office. Sarah was trembling, not from cold, but from a mix of anger and fear that made her feel nauseous. He's not bluffing, she whispered. George has contacts in Washington, D.C., at the IRS, in the press. He can destroy your company, Alexander. Alexander stood up and walked to the window, watching the drizzle fall over New York City. His mind was racing, evaluating options and consequences. Sarah, he finally said without turning around, I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there anything about your situation that you haven't told me? Any detail that could affect how we handle this? Sarah hesitated, and that hesitation was enough for Alexander to turn and look her directly in the eye. What haven't you told me? He asked with an intensity she had never seen before. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing the moment of total truth had arrived. There are two things. First, my father is not just a former minister. He still has active political influence and is an informal advisor to the current Secretary of Agriculture. Second, she paused, clearly struggling with herself. Second, Alexander insisted. Second, I didn't come to New York just to escape the marriage. I also came because I discovered that George is involved in an overpricing scheme in export contracts. He pays bribes to government officials in exchange for expedited licenses and tax reductions. Sarah spoke quickly, as if wanting to rid herself of the weight of the words. And my father might know about this. Alexander was silent for a long moment, processing the explosive implications of what he had just heard. Sarah, he finally said with an oddly calm voice, you just told me that you're fleeing not only from an arranged marriage, but potentially from a network of corruption involving your own family? Yes, she admitted, unable to meet his gaze. And when exactly were you planning to tell me this? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah realized that by omitting crucial information, she had betrayed the trust Alexander had placed in her. And now, both were much more deeply involved in a dangerous situation than either had imagined. Sarah's revelation created an abyss of silence in the Tech Vision office that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. Alexander remained motionless by the window, watching the city lights flicker through the drizzle, while processing the explosive implications of what he had just discovered. The woman he had come to trust more and more, for whom he had developed feelings he refused to name, had omitted information that put not only his business, but potentially his freedom at risk. Alexander, Sarah began with a hesitant voice, I can explain why I didn't tell you before. Can you? He turned slowly, and she was startled by the coldness she found in his brown eyes. Can you really explain how you justify involving me in a situation that could include a federal investigation, congressional inquiry, involvement with corruption schemes, without giving me the chance to make an informed choice? Sarah rose from the chair, her legs trembling slightly. Because I knew that if I told you everything at once, you would never help me. And I really needed that help. So you lied by omission. Alexander's voice was controlled, but Sarah could sense the anger simmering just below the surface. You put my company, my employees, my hard-earned reputation at risk to solve your personal problems. That's not how it was, Sarah exclaimed, her own anger beginning to surface. I came here with the intention of building a mutually beneficial partnership. The feelings that developed between us, the personal involvement, that wasn't planned. Feelings? Alexander laughed bitterly. How can I trust any feelings when I discover that our entire relationship was built on half-truths and psychological manipulation? The accusation hit Sarah like a slap. She knew Alexander had every reason to feel betrayed, but the suggestion that everything between them had been calculated and false hurt her deeply. Do you think I faked everything? The moments of intimacy, the deep conversations, the connection we developed. Her voice rose in pitch, loaded with genuine emotion. Do you think I'm a sociopath capable of faking feelings for months on end? I don't know what you're capable of, Alexander replied brutally. A behavioral psychologist trained to read and manipulate people. Someone who admits to having used insider information about my company to get close to me. Honestly, Sarah, how can I distinguish between what's real and what's strategy? The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain against the windows and the distant hum of nighttime traffic. Sarah felt tears burning her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Not now, when Alexander already doubted the authenticity of her emotions. All right, she finally said, her voice steady. You're right to be suspicious. I withheld crucial information, and that was wrong. But I'm not going to beg you to believe me or pretend that our mutual feelings are just my imagination. She walked over to the table and began gathering her personal belongings from the consulting room. A few psychology books, a mug with the NYU logo, family photographs she had placed on the shelf. What are you doing? Alexander asked, his voice losing some of its previous coldness. Leaving, Sarah replied, continuing to pack her things. You've made it clear that you don't trust me anymore, so it doesn't make sense for me to stay here. I'll handle my situation on my own, as I should have done from the start. Sarah, wait. Alexander took a step toward her. You can't just leave. George made it clear that he will pursue me no matter what I do, she interrupted, closing the box where she had placed her belongings. At least this way you won't be harmed by my problems. Alexander watched her for a moment, struggling with himself. Part of him wanted to let her go, protect his own interests, avoid further complications. But another part, the same one that had driven him to help so many people over the years, refused to abandon her at her most vulnerable moment. And where will you go? He asked, genuinely concerned. I don't know, Sarah admitted, stopping her packing. Maybe I'll go back to the Midwest and face the consequences. Maybe I'll try to hide in another state. Or maybe, she hesitated, maybe I'll report everything I know about George and my father to the authorities. That would be social and familial suicide, Alexander observed. Probably, she agreed with a sad smile. But at least it would be honest. And maybe, eventually, I could live with myself. The desperate courage in her voice touched something deep within Alexander. He recognized in that self-destructive determination the same strength that had driven him to leave the security of a stable job to start his own company years ago. Sarah, he said, walking closer, sit down. We need to talk like adults about this situation. She hesitated, then returned to the armchair, but maintained the tense posture of someone ready to leave at any moment. First, Alexander began, sitting in the chair opposite her, you're right. I reacted with anger because I felt betrayed, but part of that anger comes from fear. Fear of having emotionally involved myself with someone who turned out to be more complicated than I imagined. Sarah watched him closely, trying to read between the lines. Second, he continued, despite the omission, you didn't lie about your professional qualifications or the results you've achieved here at the company. Your analyses of the executives were accurate, and the changes implemented brought real improvements. And third, she asked, sensing there was more. Third, Alexander took a deep breath, I can't just let you face this alone. Not because I'm naive or because I'm romantically involved, but because it's the right thing to do. Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Alexander, you don't understand the magnitude of what you might be facing. If George really has the power, I suspect, he can destroy everything you've built. Maybe, Alexander agreed. But if he has that power, then other people are being harmed by him too. And if we have information that can expose him, then we have a moral responsibility to act. You're talking about a war, Sarah warned. Not just against George, but potentially against a network of influences that includes my own family. Then let it be a war, Alexander replied with renewed determination. But if we're going to fight, let's fight together and with all the cards on the table. No more omissions, no more half-truths, all or nothing. Sarah studied his face, searching for signs of hesitation or doubt, but found only steely resolve. All right, she finally said. All or nothing. But you need to know that once we start down this path, there may be no turning back. George is not the kind of man who forgives or forgets. Neither am I, Alexander replied, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. At that moment, the office phone rang again. They both looked at the device with apprehension, instinctively knowing that the temporary truce had ended. Alexander answered, TechVision USA. Mr. Smith, an unfamiliar female voice spoke quickly with evident nervousness. My name is Carla Mendoza. I'm an investigative journalist from Time. I've received information about irregularities in your company and would like to give you the opportunity to comment before the article is published. Alexander activated the speakerphone for Sarah to hear. What kind of irregularities, Ms. Mendoza? are hiring consultants without proper bidding, personal relationships influencing business decisions, possible conflicts of interest involving government contracts, she quickly enumerated. And the article will air tomorrow morning, but I can include your version of the facts if you would like to comment. Alexander and Sarah exchanged meaningful glances. George's destruction machine was already in motion. Ms. Mendoza, Alexander said calmly, I would like to schedule a meeting in person to present my version. But I also have information that may interest your investigative reporting about much more serious irregularities in the agribusiness sector. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What's the type of information? The kind that wins investigative journalism awards, Alexander replied, looking directly at Sarah. But I only speak in person, with guarantees of source protection. After scheduling the meeting for the next day, Alexander hung up the phone and turned to Sarah. Last chance to back out. After this, we're officially at war. Sarah thought for a moment about her family, everything she would lose, all the risks they were taking. Then she thought of all the women who could become future victims of George, of all the small farmers who would be harmed by the corruption schemes, of all the people suffering in silence because no one had the courage to confront the powerful. War it is then, she said, extending her hand to Alexander. But this time, we fight together and with complete honesty. They shook hands, sealing a pact that would forever change the course of their lives. Outside, the drizzle continued to fall over New York City. But inside the office, two unlikely allies were preparing for a battle that would test not only their courage, but also the depth of the feelings that had grown between them amid the chaos. Friday morning dawned, with a timid sun trying to break through the heavy clouds over New York City, creating a dramatic contrast between light and shadow that perfectly mirrored the tension in the Tech Vision office. Alexander had spent the night awake, alternating between reviewing the company's financial documents and researching everything he could find about George Anderson and his political connections. Sarah arrived early, bringing a bulky folder with copies of documents she had discreetly photographed during her last months in the Midwest. I got this the last time I was at my parents' house, she explained, spreading the photocopies across the conference table. George left some papers in my father's office during a business visit. I found it strange and took pictures before he took them away. Alexander examined the documents with increasing attention. They were export contracts with inflated values, correspondence between George and officials from the Department of Agriculture, and spreadsheets detailing payments to third parties that were clearly disguised bribes under the guise of consulting. Sarah, this is pure dynamite, he murmured, studying a particularly incriminating spreadsheet. If this is authentic, we have direct evidence of a scheme that could involve tens of millions. It is authentic, she confirmed with absolute certainty. I recognize George's handwriting and the signature of the minister's private secretary. But Alexander, she hesitated, there's something else you need to know. Alexander looked up from the documents. What else? Tuck, on the last page, there's a handwritten note mentioning Tech Vision. Sarah pointed to a corner of the paper where hurried small handwriting was visible. George had been investigating your company for months, long before I came to New York City. Alexander took the page and read the note with growing disbelief. Tech Vision, possible competitor in agricultural automation contracts. Check the owner's fiscal and personal vulnerabilities. Neutralize if necessary. He already considered you a threat, Sarah said softly. My appearance here just gave him an excuse to accelerate his plans against you. The realization hit Alexander like a punch to the stomach. He was not just collateral damage in Sarah's escape. He was a deliberate target of George, who saw Tech Vision as a threat to his own corruption schemes in agribusiness. This changes everything, he said, standing up and walking to the window. It means that even if you went back to the Midwest and married him, he would still come after my company eventually. Exactly, Sarah agreed. That's why I said we needed to fight. There's no backing down now. At 10 in the morning, journalist Carla Johnson arrived at the office. She was a woman in her 40s, with brown hair tied in a practical bun, discreet glasses, and a determined expression reminiscent of an experienced detective. She carried a worn leather folder and a digital recorder that she placed on the table after obtaining permission to record the conversation. "Mr. Smith, Miss Sarah," she began, consulting her notes, "I received anonymous information about irregularities involving your hiring as a consultant, alleged conflicts of interest, and improper use of company resources. I would like to hear your version." Alexander and Sarah exchanged a glance, having mentally rehearsed that conversation all morning. "Ms. Johnson," Alexander began in a formal tone, "before answering your questions, I need to know, are you only interested in a superficial story about alleged irregularities in a tech company? Or are you willing to investigate a much larger corruption scheme involving overpricing in export contracts, bribes to public officials, and the use of insider information to destroy competitors?" Carla's eyes lit up with the predatory interest of an experienced journalist who had caught wind of an important story. "Go on." Sarah opened the folder and began to show the documents. "George Anderson of Anderson Exports is involved in a systematic corruption scheme that has already moved at least 50 million in inflated contracts over the past 3 years. Over the next hour, they meticulously presented all the evidence, explained the political connections, detailed George's pattern of abusive behavior, and revealed how Sarah's personal situation had served as a catalyst to expose the broader scheme. "This is extraordinary," Carla said, reviewing her notes. "But you understand that you are accusing a powerful man with significant political connections. He will deny everything and will likely sue you for defamation." "We understand," Alexander replied. "But we also understand that people will continue to be harmed if we do not act. Small farmers losing their land, women being coerced into abusive marriages, honest businessmen being destroyed by unfair competition." Carla turned off the recorder and put away her notes. "I need to independently verify this information before publishing anything. This may take a few weeks. A few weeks may be too late," Sarah observed. "George has already started the campaign of destruction against us. If he discovered that we spoke to the press—" "Leave that to me," Carla replied with a confident smile. "I have experience in protecting sources and speeding up investigations when necessary, but—" She hesitated. "Do you have a safe place to stay? Because once this story is published, you will need to protect yourselves." It was a question none of them had fully considered. Alexander quickly thought through his options. Hotels were easily traceable, a friend's house would put them at risk, and his own apartment was obviously known. "I have a property in the Catskills," he finally said. "A cabin I bought a few years ago but rarely use. It's registered under a holding company, so it would be hard to trace." "Good idea," Sarah approved. "Isolation and discretion." After Carla left, promising to keep in daily contact about the progress of the investigation, Alexander and Sarah spent the rest of the day organizing preparations for what would essentially be a strategic escape. "I need to wrap up some things at the company before I leave," Alexander said, delegating responsibilities to his top executives without fully explaining the situation. "And you? Is there anything you need to do in New York City?" Sarah thought for a moment. "I want to call my grandma. If we're going to expose everything publicly, she deserves to know before reading it in the papers." The call to a small town in the Midwest was emotionally charged. Sarah explained everything to Grandma Mary, who listened in silence before responding with the wisdom of her 89 years. "Granddaughter," said the frail but firm voice of her grandmother, 60 years ago, I stayed silent when I should have spoken. Don't make the same mistake. Some battles are worth fighting, even when we know we will lose a lot in the process. Grandma, this could destroy our family." "No, Sarah, this could save our family from destroying itself from within," Grandma Mary gently corrected. "What George did is wrong. And what your father is allowing is also wrong. Someone needs to have the courage to say it. After the call, Sarah found Alexander finishing backing up all the important files at the company. "How did it go?" he asked. "My grandma gave me her blessing to move forward," Sarah replied with a sad smile. "She said some battles are worth fighting. And you? Do you still think it's worth it?" Sarah looked out the window at the city stretching to the horizon, thinking about everything they were about to leave behind. Safety, stability, the possibility of a quiet life. Better question, how could we live with ourselves if we didn't fight? Alexander nodded, understanding that they had crossed a point of no return. It was no longer just about protecting Sarah or saving his company. It was about doing what was right, regardless of personal consequences. "Then let's go to the Catskills," he said, "and hope our courage is enough for what lies ahead." As they packed their things for the trip, neither mentioned the elephant in the room, the fact that they would be completely alone, away from everything and everyone, facing not only external threats, but also the unresolved romantic tension that had grown between them over the past few months. At 7 in the evening, they left New York City heading toward the mountains, taking only the essentials and carrying the weight of decisions that would forever change their lives. The road wound through the New York landscape, and as they moved away from the city, both felt a mix of fear and relief, knowing they had finally chosen a side in the war that George had declared against them. The cabin in the Catskills was a wooden and stone refuge nestled among century-old trees, overlooking the misty valley that stretched like a sea of low clouds. The mountain air, pure and cold even at the end of winter, contrasted sharply with the suffocating atmosphere of tension they had left behind in New York City. Alexander had bought the property 3 years earlier as an investment that also served as an escape from business pressure. But this was the first time he truly needed it as a sanctuary. Sarah walked along the wooden porch, watching as the fog slowly moved between the trees, creating an almost surreal scene of tranquility. For a few precious moments, she managed to forget the storm that was approaching and simply breathe. Alexander was in the kitchen making coffee, and the familiar aroma brought an unexpected sense of domestic normalcy. "It's beautiful here," she said when he joined her on the porch, offering a steaming mug. "I understand why you bought this place. I bought it in my early years of success," Alexander explained, leaning against the wooden railing. "I thought I needed a place to relax and disconnect. Ironic that I'm only really using it for that now." They remained in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching a robin hop between the nearby branches. It was easy to pretend they were just two people on a romantic getaway in the mountains, away from the complications of urban life. The illusion was shattered by the sound of Sarah's cell phone. The name on the screen made her freeze. "Dad, are you going to answer?" Alexander asked, noticing her hesitation. Sarah took a deep breath and accepted the call. "Hello, Dad." Colonel Edwards' voice came loaded with a controlled fury she knew well. "Sarah Smith, you have crossed every boundary of decency and family respect. Dad, I can explain." "Explain," he exploded. "Explain how you publicly defamed an honest man, how you made up lies to escape your responsibilities, how you embarrassed our entire family." Sarah gestured for Alexander to activate the speakerphone, realizing it was important for him to hear the conversation. "Dad, these aren't lies. George is involved in corruption, and you know it. George showed me all the evidence you fabricated." The colonel's voice trembled with rage. "Forged documents, edited photographs, an elaborate hoax to justify your family betrayal. You conspired with that opportunist from New York City to destroy a decent man. The documents aren't fake. Dad, Sarah, adapter sois. Helena, Sarah, Gustavo, George, Colonel, Dona Rosa, Grandma Rosie, Conselheiro Lafayette, a small town in the Midwest. Puke SP, she insisted, her own voice hardening. "You know I wouldn't lie about something so serious. I don't know what you're capable of anymore," he replied coldly. "The daughter I raised would never do this to her family. You've become a stranger, Sarah, a stranger who chose money and luxury in New York City over the honor and tradition of her own home. The words cut deep, but Sarah forced herself to maintain her composure. Dad, George is manipulating you. He only showed you the documents he wanted to show, told you only the version that favors him. Enough, the colonel shouted. You have one last chance to fix this disastrous situation. Come home immediately, marry George as agreed, and publicly retract all these unfounded accusations. If you do that, maybe we can still save something of the family reputation. And what if I refuse? The pause that followed was heavy with finality. Then you are no longer my daughter. Your name will be removed from the will. Your birth certificate will be kept alongside the photographs of other relatives who have dishonored our family. You will become a blank page in the history of the Johnsons. The call ended, leaving Sarah holding the silent phone with visibly trembling hands. Alexander approached and gently took the device from her hands, turning it off completely. He wasn't bluffing, she whispered. My dad really believes I made all this up. Or he knows it's true and is choosing to protect his own interests, Alexander suggested softly. Men like your father have built entire careers on political alliances and mutual favors. Admitting that George is corrupt would mean admitting that he himself might be compromised. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding the brutal logic of the politics and business that governed her father's world. He chose his side, and it wasn't me. Over the next 2 days, they established a strange routine of domestic normalcy intertwined with preparations for a psychological war. Mornings were dedicated to organizing evidence and keeping in touch with Carla Johnson, who reported steady progress in independently verifying the information provided. Afternoons were filled with simple activities, hiking the mountain trails, preparing meals together, reading by the fireplace. It was during these moments of forced tranquility that the unresolved romantic tension between them became almost tangible. Alexander found himself watching the way the firelight danced in Sarah's blonde hair as she read. Sarah noticed how his shoulders relaxed when he thought no one was looking, revealing a vulnerability he rarely showed in the business environment. On Tuesday night, as the rain pounded against the windows of the wooden house, they were organizing documents at the dining table when Sarah made an observation that completely changed the tone of the conversation. Alexander, can I ask you something personal? He looked up from the spreadsheets. Of course. Why have you never married? I mean, you have everything most women would consider attractive. Success, intelligence, looks, generosity. Alexander fell silent for a long moment, clearly debating with himself how much honesty to share, because I could never distinguish between women who wanted me and women who wanted my life. And he hesitated, because I developed a deep distrust about my own motivations in relationships. What do you mean? I constantly wonder if I'm genuinely interested in someone or if I'm just trying to prove something to myself. If I'm seeking real connection or just validation of my success, he admitted with an honesty that surprised her. It's hard to build intimacy when you constantly question your own intentions. Sarah nodded in understanding. It's the curse of analytical people. We think too much, question too much, doubt our own feelings too much. And you, why have you never had a serious relationship aside from the arranged engagement? She smiled sadly. Because I grew up in an environment where romantic love was seen as a dangerous luxury. My mother always said, love comes after marriage, if it comes at all. I rebelled against that by focusing entirely on my career, but in the process, I forgot how to allow emotional vulnerability. Until now, Alexander said softly. Until now, she agreed, maintaining eye contact. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unexpressed possibilities. They both felt the magnetic attraction, the intellectual and emotional connection that had grown over the months, but they also understood the complexity of their situation. Sarah, Alexander finally said, I need you to know that my feelings for you have nothing to do with our business partnership or your family situation. They exist independently of all that. "I know," she replied simply. "And mine for you do too. But I also know that this isn't the right time," he continued. "You're vulnerable, escaping a traumatic situation, and I don't want you to think later that I took advantage of your emotional dependency." Sarah stood up from her chair and walked over to where he was sitting. "Alexander, look at me." He raised his eyes, finding unwavering determination in her green gaze. "I am not a helpless victim," she said firmly. "I am an intelligent adult woman who has made conscious choices about my life, including the choice to trust you, to fight by your side, and," she hesitated for just a moment, "to develop deep feelings for you." "Sarah, don't protect me from my own feelings," she interrupted him. "I've had enough people trying to make decisions for me. You don't need to be another one." The rain intensified outside, creating a cocoon of intimacy within the warm house. Alexander stood up, moving close enough to feel her subtle perfume, to see the small golden freckles that dotted her cheeks. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. In response, Sarah leaned forward and kissed him, a soft yet determined kiss that carried months of accumulated tension and repressed feelings. When they pulled apart, both were breathing irregularly. "I'm sure," she whispered against his lips. What followed was a night in the intimacy that transcended the physical, intertwining the bodies and souls of two people who had found in each other not only passion, but also profound mutual understanding. Amidst caresses and whispered conversations, they explored not only each other's bodies, but also the last hidden corners of their personalities. When dawn broke, they awoke entwined before the fireplace that had reduced to warm embers, covered only by a wool blanket and the sensation of having crossed a definitive threshold in their relationship. "I don't regret it," said Sarah, tracing lazy circles on Alexander's chest. "Neither do I," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "But this changes everything, doesn't it?" "It does," she agreed. "Now we are not just fighting for justice or for our careers. We are fighting for the right to have a life together." At that moment, Alexander's phone rang, interrupting the morning intimacy. It was Carla Johnson, and her voice was laden with urgency. "Alexander, Sarah, you need to see the news. George has anticipated our moves." The screen of the television in the cabin's living room displayed a scene that made Sarah and Alexander's blood run cold. George Anderson was at an impromptu press conference in front of the Plaza Hotel, flanked by two dark-suited lawyers and a press officer meticulously organizing every angle of the presentation. The banner behind him read, "Defense of Honor and Truth," in gold letters on a navy blue background. "As you can see from the evidence I distributed to the press," George spoke with perfectly calculated indignation, "I have been the victim of a conspiracy designed to destroy my reputation and my business. Ms. Sarah Smith, my ex-fiancée, in collusion with businessman Alexander Smith, fabricated false documents and created a defamatory narrative to justify the breaking of our engagement." Sarah felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. On the screen, George displayed versions of the documents she had provided to Carla, but now marked as gross forgeries by handwriting experts he had hired. "The motivation is obvious," George continued, with the convincing performance of a deeply wounded man. Miss Sarah was seduced by the promises of wealth and social status offered by Mr. Smith, who in turn saw in our family situation an opportunity to eliminate a competitor in the agribusiness market. Alexander raised the volume, his jaw tense with contained anger. "I have here," George lifted a leather folder, "evidence that Mr. Smith illegally investigated my company for months, seeking privileged information to use against me. I also have documentation that TechVision USA has serious tax irregularities that were uncovered during my defensive investigation." The camera focused on reporters asking questions, and Sarah recognized some prominent faces from national journalism. George had orchestrated this like a military operation, choosing the perfect timing to preempt any story Carla might publish. "Mr. Smith," A journalist from a major network asked, "Are you suggesting that you were a victim of blackmail?" "I am not suggesting. I'm categorically stating," George replied with absolute conviction. "Miss Sarah and Mr. Smith tried to force me to accept the breakup of the engagement through threats of media exposure based on lies. When I refused to be intimidated, they escalated to fabricating false evidence." Alexander's phone rang. It was Carla, her voice tense with urgency. "Are you watching this?" "We are," Alexander replied, activating the speakerphone. "He completely preempted us," Carla said quickly. "Not only did he discredit your documents, but he also created a convincing alternative narrative. Worse still, he has seemingly legitimate evidence of irregularities at TechVision." Sarah felt the world spinning. "How is this possible?" "Because he planted those irregularities." Carla's voice was heavy with professional frustration. "My independent verification found that someone hacked TechVision systems in recent weeks and inserted false transactions, altered contracts, modified accounting records. It's a professional act of digital sabotage." Alexander ran his hand through his hair, understanding the magnitude of the trap they had fallen into. He didn't just defend himself. He turned us into the villains of the story. On television, George continued his masterful performance. "I want to make it clear that I'm not seeking personal revenge. Despite the betrayal and humiliation, I still have feelings for Miss Sarah. If she distances herself from the toxic influences that corrupted her and returns to her family, I am willing to forgive and rebuild our future together." The performative generosity of the statement was brilliant in its cruelty. George presented himself simultaneously as a victim and as a magnanimous man, willing to forgive the woman who had been seduced by an unscrupulous businessman. "As for Mr. Smith," George adopted a harsher tone, "I will be filing a criminal complaint for defamation, forgery, and illegal investigation of a private company. The IRS has already been notified about the irregularities discovered in his company." Sarah turned off the television, unable to watch any longer. The silence in the cabin was oppressive, filled only by the sound of the rain that had resumed. "He destroyed us," she whispered. "Completely, not yet," Alexander said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Carla, were you able to independently verify any of our documents?" "Some, yes," the journalist replied hesitantly. "But after this press conference, my editor is reluctant to publish anything. George not only discredited the evidence, but created a narrative that makes us look like the conspirators." For the next few hours, they watched helplessly as George's narrative dominated all media outlets. Political commentators debated the new tactic of reputation destruction through sophisticated fake news technology. Experts were interviewed about how unscrupulous businessmen can use digital resources to fabricate evidence. The Smith family issued an official statement, deeply lamenting Sarah's behavior and reiterating full confidence in the integrity of George. Anderson. Sarah's phone rang constantly. Throughout the afternoon, reporters, former college classmates, even people she barely knew called seeking statements or simply satisfying morbid curiosity. She eventually turned off the phone. Raphael's phone rang, but Alexander's continued to buzz with calls from lawyers, worried clients, and panicked employees at TechVision USA. 3 major clients have already cancelled contracts. Alexander reported after a particularly difficult call with his CFO. The team is in shock, and some investors are demanding emergency meetings. "Alexander, I did this to you," Sarah said, her voice breaking with guilt. "I brought this destruction into your life." "No," he replied firmly, sitting beside her on the sofa. "George did this. He was planning to destroy me long before you showed up. You just gave him a more convenient narrative." But Sarah couldn't console herself. Watching the man she loved lose everything because of her situation, she felt an overwhelming weight of responsibility. "There is a way out," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "What?" "I go back to the Midwest. I married George. I publicly retract all accusations and admit that I made everything up because I was emotionally unstable. I testify that you were manipulated by me and had no blame in anything." Alexander stared at her in disbelief. "Sarah, you can't be serious." "Perfectly serious," she continued, each word costing her immensely. "It's the only way for you to regain your reputation and your company. George would get what he wants, and you would be free to rebuild your life." "And you?" Alexander asked, his voice laden with horror. "You would marry a man we know is abusive and corrupt?" Sarah looked at him with tear-filled eyes that refused to spill. "I would survive, and you would be safe." The suggestion hung between them like a death sentence. Alexander realized that Sarah was genuinely considering sacrificing herself to save him, and the realization filled him simultaneously with deep love and fierce anger. "Don't even think about it," he said, taking her hands. "Not for a second. I won't let you destroy yourself to save me." "Alexander, be practical," Sarah pleaded. "You have a company, employees who depend on you, a lifetime of work that could be destroyed. I have, what? A family that disowned me, a career that barely started." "You have me," Alexander interrupted her with fierce intensity. "And I have you, and neither of us is going to give up on the other to satisfy a sociopath." At that moment, Alexander's phone rang again. It was an unknown number, but he answered anyway. "Mr. Smith," an elderly, firm female voice spoke from the other end. "My name is Grandma Mary Johnson. I'm Sarah's grandmother. I need to speak with both of you urgently." Sarah's eyes widened, recognizing her grandmother's voice. "Grandma, how did you get our number?" "Dear, at 89 years old, one learns to find out what needs to be discovered," Grandma Mary replied with a touch of dry humor. "I watched that fool George on television, and I have some important things to tell you both." "What kind of things?" Alexander asked. "The kind that can turn this game completely." The old woman's voice gained a steely determination. "But I can't talk over the phone. Can you come see me in a small town in the Midwest?" Sarah and Alexander exchanged glances. Leaving their hideout in the mountains meant exposing themselves, but the urgency in Grandma Mary's voice suggested she had crucial information. "Grandma, it's dangerous for us to travel right now," Sarah explained. "Dear," Grandma Mary replied with a firmness that brooked no argument, "I have information that George would kill to keep secret, and I have evidence he thought he had destroyed long ago. If you want to defeat this man, you need to come here, tonight." The call ended, leaving Sarah and Alexander staring at each other with a mix of hope and apprehension. Grandma Mary had just offered them something they thought they had lost forever, a chance to fight back. "It could be a trap," Alexander observed. "Or it could be our salvation," Sarah replied. "My grandmother has never lied to me. If she says she has something important, then she does." "Then let's go to the Midwest," Alexander decided, standing up. "But this time, let's be prepared for anything." As they quickly packed their bags, neither mentioned the obvious, that they were betting everything on one last desperate gamble. But both knew that, together, they were capable of facing any storm that awaited them. The night drive from the Catskills to the small town in the Midwest was made in tense silence, with Alexander navigating the winding roads, while Sarah gazed at the mountainous landscape, illuminated only by the car's headlights. With each mile they approached her hometown, the tension mounted. They knew they were voluntarily entering George's territory, where his influence was strongest and the risks exponentially higher. The small town in the Midwest was a typical historic town, with cobblestone streets winding between preserved colonial houses and Baroque churches that bore witness to centuries of tradition. Grandma Mary's house was in the historic center, a two-story building with thick stone walls and colonial blue-painted wooden windows. It was nearly midnight when they arrived, but all the lights were on, creating a warm contrast against the dark, empty street. Grandma Mary greeted them at the door, and Sarah was surprised by her grandmother's appearance. Despite her 89 years, the woman stood tall, with piercing blue eyes that radiated impressive lucidity. She wore a simple floral dress and a crocheted shawl, but there was something in her posture that conveyed a natural authority developed over nearly 9 decades of life. "Come in quickly," she said, checking the street before closing the door. "The walls have ears in this town, especially when it comes to George's business." The living room of the house was a living museum of family history, old photographs on the walls, rosewood furniture inherited from past generations, a small altar with Catholic saints, and a bookshelf filled with books that revealed the owner's love for reading. Grandma Mary served coffee in delicate porcelain cups and sat in a velvet armchair. "Grandma Mary," Helena began, "what do you know that can help us?" Grandma Mary studied both of them for a moment before responding. "First, you need to understand something important. George Anderson is not just corrupt, he is dangerous. Much more dangerous than you can imagine." Alexander leaned forward. "What do you mean, Grandma Mary?" The elderly woman stood up and walked over to an antique desk, from which she retrieved an ornate wooden box. In 1987, when George was just 25 years old and had just inherited his father's company, there was an accident involving a small farmer who refused to sell his land to him. She opened the box, revealing yellowed photographs, old documents, and newspaper clippings. John Parker, an honest man who owned a strategic property that George coveted. John refused to sell for 3 consecutive years. Despite increasing pressure, Helena picked up one of the photographs, showing a middle-aged man smiling next to a wife and 2 small children. "What happened to him?" "He died in a tractor accident," Grandma Mary replied with evident bitterness. "The equipment mysteriously lost its brakes on a steep hill. The widow, desperate and without resources to maintain the property, sold it to George for 1/3 of its market value." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you suggesting it was murder?" "I'm not suggesting. I'm stating," Grandma Mary said with absolute firmness. "Because my late husband, God rest his soul, was a mechanic, specializing in agricultural equipment. He secretly examined the wreckage of the tractor before it was lost in a fire at the junkyard." She pulled from the box a brown envelope containing technical photographs and a handwritten report. "Deliberate sabotage of the braking system. My husband documented everything, but never reported it because he feared for our family's safety." Helena examined the documents with growing horror. "Why did you keep this for so long?" "Because I was waiting for the right moment," Grandma Mary explained. John Parker was not the only victim. Over the years, there have been other convenient accidents involving people who opposed George's interests. She pulled out more documents from the box. Local newspaper clippings reporting suspicious deaths. Photographs of properties that changed hands under questionable circumstances. And a handwritten list with names and dates. 5 people in 35 years, she enumerated. All deaths that directly benefited George, all classified as accidents by local authorities who were, let's say, financially motivated not to investigate deeply. Alexander studied the documents with increasing disbelief. "Grandma Mary, this means George is not just corrupt, but a serial killer. And it means Helena was never safe," the elderly woman added, looking directly at her granddaughter. "If she had married him and later tried to divorce or expose his crimes, she would have become just another tragic statistic." The silence that followed was filled only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Helena processed the revelation that she had escaped not only an abusive marriage, but possibly a long-term death sentence. "But there's more," Grandma Mary continued, pulling a sealed envelope from the box. "These are copies of original documents proving all of George's corruption transactions over the last 10 years. Authentic, not the forgeries you had." Alexander opened the envelope and examined the papers. Authentic contracts, correspondence with official stamps, detailed bank records. It was a collection of evidence that would make any prosecutor salivate. "How did you get this?" Helena asked, impressed. Grandma Mary smiled slyly. "Dear, when you live in a small town for almost 9 decades, you develop quite an impressive network of contacts. Retired secretaries who keep copies of important documents, bank employees who remember suspicious transactions, drivers who overhear interesting conversations. You were investigating George all along, Alexander realized. Ever since I learned about the arranged engagement, she confirmed. I knew something was wrong with that man. Women of my generation develop an instinct for dangerous men. It's a matter of survival. Helena hugged her grandmother with tears in her eyes. Grandma, you risked your own safety to protect me. Sweetheart, at 89, what are they going to do to me? Scare me to death? Grandma Mary laughed. Besides, some battles are worth fighting, remember? Alexander mentally organized the implications of the evidence. Grandma Mary, this completely changes our situation. With this authentic evidence and the homicide cases, we can not only defend ourselves against George's accusations, but completely destroy him. Exactly, the elderly woman agreed. But there's a problem. You need to deliver this to the right authorities. George has contacts in the local police, the state prosecutor's office. Even in Washington, D.C., if this evidence falls into the wrong hands, it will disappear, like the evidence from the accidents, Helena completed. I have an idea, Alexander said, picking up the phone. Carla Johnson has contacts in the federal police and the federal prosecutor's office. Authorities who are outside George's local influence. The call to Carla revealed that the journalist had spent the last few hours independently investigating George's story and already suspected there was much more behind his public facade. If you have solid evidence of homicide and federal corruption, I can arrange a meeting with the federal police chief in Chicago, she said. He is known for being incorruptible and has the authority to act independently of local pressures. Over the next few hours, they carefully planned each step. Grandma Mary would make copies of all the evidence and store them in secure locations as a safeguard. Helena and Alexander would travel to Chicago to meet with federal authorities. Carla would coordinate the media coverage to ensure the truth was widely disseminated. There's one last thing, Grandma Mary said as the day began to dawn. George will realize you are here. This town is too small to keep secrets for long. As if her words were prophetic, the house phone rang. Grandma Mary, family residence of the Andersons, came a calm voice. Grandma Mary, the unmistakable voice of George echoed through the intercom. I heard there are some interesting visitors there. How about I stop by to greet the old friends? The implied threat was crystal clear. George knew where they were and was coming. George, Grandma Mary replied with impressive calm, you can come whenever you want. This has been my family's home for 4 generations, and we always welcome visitors. See you soon, Grandma Mary. I'm sure it will be an enlightening conversation. The call ended, and the 3 exchanged glances, understanding that the final confrontation was about to happen. He's coming here, Sarah said, fear evident in her voice. Let him come, Grandma Mary replied with iron determination. It's time for this man to discover that some people are not easily intimidated. Alexander picked up the envelope with the evidence. We need to get out of here now and take this to Chicago. No, Grandma Mary stopped him. Running away now would be admitting guilt. Stay. Face this man. Show him that you are not afraid. Grandma, he's dangerous, Sarah protested. And we have the truth, the elderly woman retorted. Besides, dear, I didn't reach 89 years by being a coward. 15 minutes later, 3 black cars stopped in front of the house. George stepped out of the first vehicle, accompanied by 2 men in suits who were clearly private security. He wore a sharp suit and a confident smile, but Sarah could see the barely contained anger in his eyes. Sarah, my love, he said as he entered the room, completely ignoring Alexander and Grandma Mary. It's time to end this charade and go home. This is my home, Sarah replied, standing beside her grandmother. George finally looked at Alexander. And you must be the famous manipulator. I hope you've enjoyed these months of fun because they're over. George, Grandma Mary intervened firmly, I suggest you leave my house immediately. He laughed. Grandma Mary, you've always been a wise woman. I'm sure you understand that this situation needs to be resolved definitively. I understand perfectly. she replied, rising from her chair with impressive dignity. That's why I called the FBI. George's smile instantly vanished. You did what? I called the authorities to deal with murderers and corrupt individuals, Grandma Mary said calmly. They should arrive any moment now. As if on cue, the sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, approaching rapidly. George's face paled as he realized he had fallen into a trap. You don't know who you're dealing with, he hissed, his mask of civility finally slipping away completely. We know exactly, Alexander replied, embracing Sarah. We're dealing with a man who thought power and influence made him untouchable. But he discovered that some people cannot be bought, intimidated, or silenced. The sirens became deafening, and through the window they could see FBI cars surrounding the house. George looked around desperately, but his escape routes were blocked. Sarah, Grandma Mary said softly, this is your chance to finally close this chapter and start a new life. When the federal agents entered the house, they found George Anderson being confronted by 3 people who refused to be his victims. A brave young woman who chose freedom over familial security, an upright businessman who preferred truth over easy profit, and a wise elderly woman who dedicated years of her life to protect her granddaughter and ensure that justice was served. 18 months after the night Sarah wrote help on a napkin, she and Alexander stood at the altar of a small church in a small town in the Midwest, exchanging vows before Grandma Mary, who radiated pride and satisfaction. Sarah's psychological consulting firm was thriving, specializing in helping executives reconcile professional success with personal values. Alexander's tech vision not only fully recovered from the scandal, but also grew even more, now with a solid reputation for business integrity. George Anderson was serving a 25-year sentence for homicide, corruption, and racketeering. His network of influence had crumbled like a house of cards when the truth finally came to light. At the wedding reception, as Sarah danced with Alexander in Grandma Mary's garden, she reflected on how a desperate cry for help had turned into the most beautiful story of love and courage in her life. Do you regret anything? Alexander asked, spinning her gently to the sound of a waltz played by a small band. Only not writing help on that napkin sooner, she replied, smiling, because that's what brought me to you. Grandma Mary watched from the porch, a deep satisfaction illuminating her wrinkled face. At 90 years old, she had lived long enough to see her granddaughter find not only true love, but also the courage to fight for it. Some battles are truly worth fighting, she murmured to herself, silently toasting with a glass of port to the couple dancing under the stars of the Midwest.